Ladies and gentlemen, my name's Paul, and in this Red Gaming Tech.com video we're going to be discussing as well as analysing tech news, which as usual has popped up the past 24 or so hours. Hopefully you're having an amazing day. We have a ton of stuff to get through in today's video. There's only going to be a single video today because I will be filming the AMD exclusive today. That should go up tomorrow. It's a little bit delayed because of things that's going on with me at the moment. I'm just preparing to actually move properties, so I'm going to have more space for filming and some other things as well. So I'm actually really looking forward to that. But just because of craziness, basically a couple of things have been slightly delayed, and I'm also prepping for reviewing a ton of hardware, so things are just a little bit manic at the moment. But getting on to the news itself, first things first, Gigabyte have done an oopsie, as AIBs tend to do. People wonder why Nvidia and AMD do not brief AIBs early. This is one of those reasons. Gigabyte have done an oopsie and have confirmed that the RTX 3060 8GB, the 3070 16GB, and finally the 3080 20GB exists. And this is courtesy of the Gigabyte Watchdogs Legion code redeeming part of their website. So, of course, it does list the cards that we do know about, like the 3080 10GB, but the aforementioned cards, the 3070 16GB and so on, are also listed here. This is courtesy, as two uses of the word courtesy, of videocards.com, who spotted this. There are still a lot of questions we have of this, not least of which the exact configuration of the RTX 3060, we don't know what that is. The 3060 Super, could be Ti, but we believe it's Super, is going to feature 4864 CUDA cores, again with 8GB of memory, but the 3060 has been somewhat elusive, and we don't know what the configuration is in terms of the CUDA core count, other than, well, probably less than the 3060 Super. And the other question too is, what about the differences between the 20GB and the 10GB 3080, for example? At the moment, I'm leaning towards the actual specs of the card in terms of the CUDA core count, clock frequencies being identical to what we have with the 3080 vanilla, or 3080 10GB, and this is actually spurred on by the fact that 3090s are actually being tested right now. There's an actual leaked review here. I'll link to the review in the video description, and this is actually way in front of the embargo. The review is from a Chinese outlet, Tech Lab, and they are reviewing the 3090 on a 10900K, and well, I will say that the 3090 is impressive, but personally speaking, I don't think it's something that gamers would necessarily want to purchase. Prosumers, though, I can understand the appeal. I'm not going to go through all of the benchmarks out of respect for their content, but I will point out a few interesting ones. Control with RTX on, we are looking at an improvement of about 9%, so 71 FPS from 65 FPS. Another extremely demanding game is Assassin's Creed Odyssey. We are looking at, again, around the 9% improvement, 65 to 71. There are other titles which don't exhibit such a performance increase. Forza is actually slightly under 5%, so 149 to 156. Whereas other games and applications are actually slightly higher. So, for example, Death Stranding with RTX disabled and with DLSS disabled too, it goes from 104 to 116, which is not an inconsequential amount of performance. Again, the 3090 is designed around prosumer work primarily, simply because of the amount of VRAM and other changes to the architecture. I would be interested to see applications which are more like 3D rendering based. This isn't to say that it's not an improvement over the 3080, and the other fact too is that we only have one outlet which reviews have gone up. There are some synthetic results too from the likes of Firestrike, and those results are actually higher. We're looking at 19-20% for some of the synthetics, but again, these are gameplay results that I'm referring to here, so we can just wait and see. As always, when it's like 1 or 2 reviews that have been posted, you definitely should not necessarily take into account those results because, well, you know, something hinky could have been going on with their setup. It's unlikely, but you never know. Maybe, you know, they're having driver or software issues or something else that was slightly holding the card back. I'm not saying they were. I'm just saying that until we have more reviews available, I would, you know, kind of err on the side of caution. But moving from Nvidia, we are going to shift our way, and yes, that is a pun given the topics we're going to be covering, to the consoles, because this is going to be interesting. Yeah, all hell has broken loose over the past few days on the internet, and initially, honestly, I was not going to cover this topic because it's just not true. We'll talk about the PlayStation Defense Force first, and then we're going to be defending the Xbox. So first of all, with the PlayStation, a chap on Twitter, he's now deleted the tweet, and I'm not going to post his name or anything like that. I don't want you to find the guy. I don't want you to bug him. Let's just talk about the tech for a moment. According to what he stated, a developer in his Discord was commenting that these are the SmartShift profiles for the PlayStation 5. So you can see that if the CPU is running at 2 GHz, the GPU will hit 2.2 GHz, 3.5 GHz for the CPU equals 1.2 GHz from the GPU. And I've gotten so many messages about this, and all I can say is it's a load of crap. I can't put it any other way other than it's totally false. There are a multitude of reasons this is false, and I'm not going to go through all of them because I will be here until the next year. But I will go through some of the big ones. First of all, the keyword is SmartShift, not profiles. The fact is, SmartShift is designed to automatically divert power to the chip as necessary. We'll explain more about that in a second. So, the developers' early development kits, developers were given profiles because SmartShift was not working correctly. This has subsequently been, well, resolved as development kits improve, as is the case for the Xbox, PlayStation, Nintendo Switch, whatever. Early development kits, shock and horror, aren't working as well as final development kits. So early dev kits had profiles, but modern development kits, developers don't need to worry about this. It's taken care of, essentially. There is naturally some level of optimization developers are prompted to do, because that's the same with any console ever, but nowadays it's not like this. You don't have to worry about, you know, being so arbitrary about these decisions. Secondly, these figures themselves are completely rubbish. They do not match to anything that Mark Cerny has stated. Yes, he is biased, he does work for Sony, but what he says in terms of performance makes sense, and we'll go into why technically in just a moment. Secondly, they don't match what developers have said on and off record. A very famous example of this is a Crytek developer who actually was commenting on the performance of the PlayStation 5 and how SmartShift has been very beneficial to their workloads and all of this stuff. He was subsequently, I believe, pressured into having the interview removed. But if you Google something like Crytek developer PS5 interview, it will pop up, and there will be translations of it available. It's quite interesting to check out, and I would encourage you to do so for your own reconnaissance. The third thing is that, from a technical perspective, this does not match how SmartShift works on AMD's own Renoir chips, which are APUs. It just doesn't match on how that functions. There is no way that the CPU will downclock to such a significant degree on a laptop design. Furthermore, with a laptop, one of the reasons it does that is for the purposes of battery conservation. The thing with the PlayStation 5, the reason they've designed it like this is because different frames or even different workloads can shift per frame. So if you have 120 Hz that you're aiming for a game, that still takes about 8.5 milliseconds, I'm rounding down slightly, to actually render that whole frame. SmartShift can adjust the power a couple of times within that one frame. So it isn't a fixed clock where for a long period of time the CPU is hitting one clock speed and the GPU another, and then 20 seconds later it shifts again. This can be happening multiple times a frame as the CPU and GPU workloads dynamically adjust themselves. And if you want further evidence as well that power does not necessarily equal to large drops in performance, there's a couple of very interesting examples. The first, actually, is that a chap has actually taken an RTX 3090 and has performed a shunt mod. If you're unfamiliar with what a shunt mod is, the TLDR is basically you trick the GPU by performing a hardware modification to think that it's not drawing as much power as actually reality is. So there's generally like a TDP limit for a GPU, so that might be 300 watts, 250, whatever it is for the specific GPU in question. And someone performed a shunt mod on an RTX 3090. First of all, I respect them for taking the risk for a new graphics card, which costs, about 1.5k. But this shunt mod literally increases the board power consumption from 390 watts to 550. So obviously that's a significant increase in power consumption, and you can see yourself right here that the difference in the performance, it's not intangible, but yeah, it's not exactly in line with the additional power that's being eaten up. And there's also there's another fascinating article, if you're so inclined, you can check it out from Hardware Lux, and they were testing the first generation of RDNA, and they were basically undervolting it, which is what's consistent with the RDNA architecture. A lot of people with Navi architectures will undervolt the GPUs, and even though they've undervolted it, so from 0.987 volts to 0.937, which has reduced the power consumption as well from, let's say, 177 to about 166 watts. The 5700 is still getting about the same clock frequency, and you can also see the results too for the 5700 XT for its undervolting. Even though the power consumption has gone down slightly, it's around 226 from 230. So again, there's not much difference in power reduction, but you can see that the clock frequency has not regressed. In actuality, for the 5700 XT, it's actually been improved. But one of the reasons behind that too is that the way that this functions is not exactly how SmartShift works for the PlayStation 5. And this gets us to what Mark Cerny was commenting on. Eurogamer had an interview with Mark. I'm going to read out this one part verbatim. The CPU and GPU each have a power budget. Of course, the GPU power budget is the larger of the two. If the CPU doesn't use its power budget, for example, and it's capped at 3.5 GHz, then the unused portion of the budget goes to the GPU. That's what AMD calls SmartShift. There's enough power that both the CPU and GPU can potentially run at 3.5 and 2.23. It isn't the case where the developer has to choose to run one of them slower. Again, that's the other factor. This is not a developer decision. There's another phenomenon here, and we call it race to idle. Let's imagine that we are running at 30 Hz, that's 30 FPS, and you're using 28 milliseconds of our 33 millisecond budget. To clarify here, you can actually do this math yourself. So if you want to figure out how many milliseconds you have to render a frame, you can take 1000, which is the number of milliseconds in 1 second, and then you divide it by the target frame rate. So if you're targeting 30 FPS, it's 1000 divided by 30. If it's 60 FPS, it's 1000 divide by 60. You get the point. So in this case, it's a 33.33 millisecond budget. So Cerny says that we're using 28 milliseconds of our 33 milliseconds, so the GPU is idle for 5 milliseconds. the power control logic will detect the low power being consumed. After all, the GPU is not doing anything for those 5 seconds, and conclude that the frequency should increase. But that's just a pointless bump. So, instead, the net result is the GPU doesn't want to do any more work. Instead, it's assigned more work quickly, and then it's idle for longer, waiting for VSync. We use race to idle to describe what's pointless for the GPU's frequency. If you construct a variable frequency system, we are able to see, based on this phenomenon, and its equivalent on the CPU side too, is that the frequencies are usually just pegged at maximum. That's not meaningful. So in order to make a meaningful statement about the GPU frequency, we need to find a location of the game where the GPU is fully utilized for those 33.3 milliseconds. So when I made the statement that the GPU will spend most of its time near or its top of its frequency, that's what race of idle is taken into the equation. We were looking at the PlayStation 5's game situation where the whole frame was being used productively, and the same is true for the CPU, based on examination of the situation with high utilization throughout the frame, and we concluded that the CPU will spend most of its time at peak frequency. That's a lot of words, but long story short, a specific frame can take a varying amount of time to draw, and long story short, from Sony's internal testing, the CPU and GPU will remain pretty much at maxed out. Sony said that at worst case scenario, we're looking at about a 3% reduction in performance. I'm hearing the same, about 3% in real world, if the CPU is being very heavily taxed. And even then, it would be maybe half a frame to 1 frame, maybe 2 frames that happens. Again, it would depend upon A, the game, B, the workload, C, the engine, D, what's happening on screen, and a trillion other characteristics. But from multiple people I'm hearing from now, including a couple of sources that have given me some really good AMD information, I'll remind you of, if you're unfamiliar with the channel, that recently I've leaked photos of unreleased AMD graphics cards, which are the 6900 XT, and also providing tons of insight into the next generation of RDNA and Zen 3. So I can say with very good authority that the GPU for the PlayStation 5 will not reduce to anywhere near this clock frequency. It is not how reality will function. Oh god, okay, and now we're going to move over to some other comments which are making people upset, which Jim Ryan has made regarding the Xbox Series S. There's also a very interesting interview, by the way, from Eurogamer. It's just popped up, which means, like, for the 50th time now, I have to amend my Xbox Series S analysis script. Yeah, I'm not bitter. Honest. I'm not. I do think that a portion of this interview is being, I wouldn't say mistranslated, but I think people are taking it, as they tend to do, in the worst possible way. Basically, Jim Ryan, who is of course one of the head honchos over there at Sony, was discussing a potential PlayStation 5 lower spec console, and he basically said, oh, by the way, this is courtesy of AV Watch, who conducted the original interview, but it was in Japanese. You can check out the translated interview on a couple of websites. I'm using Video Games Chronicle. Again, I'll link it in the description of the video. Anyway, he basically said that they do respect every competitor's decision and their philosophies. Clearly, price is an important factor, and we respect other companies' competitive strategy, but we are fully committed to and believe in the current strategy and the effect it will have. If you look at the history of the video game business, creating special, low-priced, reduced-spec consoles has not had great results in the past. He then goes on to say that consoles will generally have shelf lives of 4, 5, 6 or even 7 years, and because now of the prevalence of 4K screens, well, he believes that a lower-spec console will basically become out of place in the living room, because there's a good chance, essentially, that you will upgrade to a higher spec screen. So what are my thoughts on this? Honestly, I think it's very difficult to know long term what the effects of multiple things are. for the Series S. I disagree with Jim Ryan where he says that the Series S is not going to be popular. I think given the price point, given what's happening in the world right now, given previous historical consoles for both Sony and Microsoft, like the Xbox One S was still selling very well. The vanilla PS4 was selling very well, despite the fact that the Pro consoles were on store shelves. Let's just be honest. They still were selling like hotcakes. People were still buying the Series S. One S. People were still buying the PS4. So I think that I don't agree with Jim there. My concern of the Series S is the spec of the RAM. The GPU I'm not concerned about. The CPU I'm not concerned about. The SSD, yes, it's smaller, but again, that's not a huge deal because you have less texture. Data, they've said it's going to be about 30% less, so I can kind of understand that. The amount of RAM, though, that could be a problem. And I think at the moment it's too early to know this stuff for certain. I do. I think that some developers have gone on record and said that they were not happy with it. There was a developer who works over at id Software and said that he was really bummed about the RAM situation. He's an engine programmer at id Software, Axel Gniting, but the tweet is now nuked. We've also had others, such as Sasan Safir. Hopefully I've pronounced that correctly too. They are a technical producer over at Remedy. Obviously, Remedy is pretty infamous for very technically demanding games. They've said that as a consumer, I love it. As a technical producer, I see trouble. Team Blur Games has also said, however, contrary to this, Gavin Stevens has said that no, he doesn't believe it's going to be any problem. It's not the same as the last generation console. Meanwhile, Microsoft have also said, from Jason Ronald, who's the director of Xbox Program Management, that they can do this. Like, they've internally done a lot of analysis of what it would mean to run the game at 4K, then scale it down to 1440 or 1080p at 60 FPS. Again, this is going to be one of those situations where we do not know how this plays out for a couple of years. From a technical perspective, have a ton more to say about this. There will be an analysis soon. I will be tweaking it again because of the Eurogamer interview. I don't know how many times now I've rewritten this script, but that's just the reality of it. I think I disagree with Sony when they said that it's not going to be popular. However, from the perspective of developers, I can understand that there's concerns over the RAM. I do think the developers will port down. I think that they'll use the Xbox Series X as the flagship, and then they will cut LODs, they will reduce resolution, whatever they need to do for the console, for the Series S. I do, however, think that when people are saying it's not a next-gen console, I don't think that's true at all. But again, I know I keep saying this, I think we're too early at the moment to judge the Series S. But with all of that said, thank you very much for watching the video. The normal stuff, like, share, comment and subscribe, and I'll see you soon. Take care of yourselves. Thanks. Bye for now.